Welcome to the Prairie FILES, a true crime podcast. Disclaimer. Please note, trigger warning. This podcast contains graphic depictions of gruesome violence that may be alarming to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Episode 7, Dangerous Offender.
Their life together changed when notorious dangerous offender Leo Teskey almost beat Dougal to death in an Edmonton apartment building. Dougal's skull was crushed, his jaw broken, and part of his ear torn off. He could no longer move, stuck in a vegetative state, only able to speak with his eyes.
Service Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, to protect children and vulnerable Albertans, we made legislative changes that banned convicted sex offenders from legally changing their names. Today, there are no restrictions prohibiting dangerous offenders from being able to legally change their names, but we're going to change that.
Now deemed a dangerous offender, meaning the 40-year-old will remain behind bars indefinitely. Provincial Court Judge Eric Peterson has ruled Teskey is such a menace, he needs to be detained away from the general public.
And I hope this is the first day of the rest of his life in prison. I hope he dies in prison. I hope he dies in prison. I hope he dies in prison.
We go to Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. This episode casts a light, not a bright one, on an individual that has left a stain on society. This atrocious monster, who from a young age would terrorize the Edmonton streets and would destroy or alter lives of almost everyone he came into contact with. This story is about a man who is so dangerous and so demoralized there is no hope for rehabilitation. Some say it's cruel and inhumane to give up on an individual like this, but I truly believe there are some people who cannot be changed and will not change. In Canada, we have a special designation for the most heinous repeat offenders. The designation dangerous offender is reserved for Canada's most violent criminals and sexual predators that walk our streets. In Canadian criminal law, a convicted person who is designated a dangerous offender may be subjected to an indeterminate prison sentence. If a Crown attorney believes that an individual may be an appropriate candidate for proceedings under the Dangerous Offenders Provisions of Canada, the accused must be convicted following a trial or a guilty plea of a, quote, a serious personal injury offense. The purpose of the legislation is to detain offenders who are deemed too dangerous to be released into our society for various reasons. Violent tendencies, inability to control their behaviors. The Parole Board of Canada is required to review the cases of an offender with a dangerous offender label every 7 years, and parole may actually be granted as well, depending on circumstances. But the offender would remain under supervision indefinitely after the initial review. According to Corrections Canada, on average, 26 dangerous offenders are admitted to the Canadian prison system each year, and that number is growing. Canada's dangerous offenders laws have their roots in the 1947 Habitual Offenders Act, which dealt solely with offenders with lengthy criminal records, and the 1948 Criminal Sexual Psychopath Act. In 1977, the designation dangerous offender replaced both habitual offender and the dangerous sexual offender. Canada got a little more tough on crime in October 2006 when the Canadian government introduced legislation that made it easier for a Crown prosecutor to obtain dangerous offenders designation. The amendments provide, among other things, that an offender found guilty of a third conviction of a designated violent or sexual offense must provide proof that he or she does not qualify as a dangerous offender. The legislation was passed in 2008. Under previous legislation, the Crown had to prove that the individual qualified as a dangerous offender. The amendment reverses the onus for an individual convicted of 3 violent offenses. Such individuals must now demonstrate to the court that despite the 3 convictions, they should not be designated as a dangerous offender. To give you an idea of how the list is growing, in 2001 there were 280 dangerous offenders in Canada. By 2015, there were 622 dangerous offenders. Most of them are sexual offenders. Today, in 2022, there could be as many as 800 plus dangerous offenders under Correction Canada's watch, up from 64 in 1996. There were 65 people designated as dangerous offenders in the province of Alberta as of early 2019, according to public safety data. In this story, we talk about just one of the hundreds of monsters who live within our borders. It was January 9th, 1988, a frigid afternoon just after lunchtime, behind the quiet Wellington strip mall. A 17-year-old, quote, juvenile delinquent would be pacing behind the Wellington Hardware at 13229 132 Street, in the alley, waiting to meet an acquaintance to sell them a small .32 caliber revolver. At some point, the gun went off, and a truck window belonging to the owner of the hardware store ended up getting shot out. The young man with the gun was found out back by the owner of the store, but made up a story that someone drove by and tried to shoot him. He would end up entering the store and headed to the bathroom to catch his bearings. Police were called out immediately. Without the kid knowing, 18-year veteran Michael Lacusta, then Detective Robert Kruinchuk, would show up separately and quickly speak with the owner of the hardware store. Police would ask the young man to come out from the washroom. When he emerged from the washroom, they would search and question the young man. He told officers his name was Mike Belcourt, but he didn't have any ID on him. They ran the name and nothing came back. He then told them that someone had shot at him in the alley, but he didn't get a very good look at him. They then had to search him. The kid apparently looked really young and harmless, but for everyone's safety, they had him remove his jacket and pull his pants down to his knees, including his underwear, in the back room. And he appeared not to have any weapons on his body or in his jacket. However, they would find some damning evidence. 45 rounds of .32 caliber ammunition would be found in his jeans pocket. An empty box of ammunition would also be found in the bathroom. The officers placed him under arrest for mischief, and it was decided that Constable Lacusta would transport the so-called Mike Belcourt to the Londonderry Police Detachment for further processing. They handcuffed the young man and placed him into Lacusta's cruiser, with the protractive shield between the front and the back seat also open. Constable Lacusta would later say, quote, "He was a person I thought that was quite harmless, and I thought I'd be in no immediate danger if he tried to grab me." It was about 1:40 p.m. when they left the hardware store, and they headed east down 132 Avenue. It would be a straight shot drive all the way down 132 Ave to 66th Street, then north just off of 137th Ave, where the police station was at the time. It's now a mosque. The ride was silent and bumpy as they made their way down the pothole-ridden, frozen asphalt towards 66th Street. Lacusta's eyes looking back occasionally through the rearview mirror at the suspect fidgeting. As soon as his eyes went back to the road, the suspect would look both ways to make sure nobody was looking before pulling out a small revolver that he had concealed the whole time in between his butt cheeks. His hand would slowly rise up and a, quote, large blam would ring out. It was amazing the car didn't fly off the road, as anyone in the car would be shocked or stunned and temporarily deafened by the loud blast. At that split moment in time, Lacusta looked back into his rearview mirror to see the kid in the back seat looking over his right shoulder, holding a small handgun in both of his hands close to his chest, pointing it directly at him. Lacusta would later say, quote, "The last thing I thought it would be was a gunfire. I thought something went wrong with the vehicle." He was quite shocked at the reality of the situation and continued to say, "I immediately brought the vehicle to a stop and rolled out. I described it as a fast exit." The officer stumbled from the car and took cover behind a fence near the Texaco station that was once there. That's when he felt the wetness and discovered blood on the back of his neck. Then he realized in horror that he had been shot. But his adrenaline was still pumping. He hadn't felt a thing up to that point. He called for help on his radio, and backup would quickly emerge on scene around 66th Street and 132 Avenue. But the shooter had already jumped into the driver's seat through the partition and fled the scene. He would later get into an accident with a truck and flee the scene undetected. The young man ended up turning himself in the next day, and his true identity would be found out shortly thereafter. His identity was found out to be that of 17-year-old Leo Matthew Teskey. He was then charged with a slew of offenses, including attempted murder of the police officer. Lacusta was rushed to hospital and in surgery within minutes after the shooting. Amazingly, Lacusta never lost consciousness during the shooting, which put him in the hospital for 9 days. He would return to work on March 8th, but would have many lasting effects such as headaches, hearing loss, loss of balance, and the loss of some eye control, as he stated in his victim impact statement. I'm sure there was some psychological component to his trauma as well. Lacusta also would write, "A crime such as this not only affects me personally, it affects my family and other peace officers and their families. They too have to reason for concern for the personal safety and the safety of their loved ones." In April 1989, a neurosurgeon who removed the bullet from Constable Lacusta's neck testified in court that his thick skull saved him from a potentially fatal situation. The only reason Constable Lacusta wasn't killed was because the bullet, upon entering his neck, struck his skull and was deflected down to the neck bone for the most part, and a full recovery, from what I could find out, was made, other than the lasting side effects, of course. Sergeant David Kessler, an RCMP firearms expert, said the .32 caliber Smith & Wesson short revolver was likely less than 12 inches away from Lacusta's head when it was fired, because of the amount of gunpowder residue they found on the officer's jacket. Teskey's defense was he was high on LSD and didn't even mean to shoot the officer. He was actually trying to shoot the windshield, or to scare the officer. The Crown couldn't actually prove Teskey intended to kill the officer, so he got off pretty easy, and he would eventually be acquitted of attempted murder. But he would be sentenced to 3 years and 10 months on charges of unlawful use of a handgun while committing an indictable offense, theft over $1,000, and unlawful escape. He was sent to the Grand Cache Provincial Jail to serve his time. After only serving a portion of his time, I believe it was 22 months because of time served, he was back out, and sure enough, in March 1992, Teskey would then stoop to an even lower level and become the type of criminal that wouldn't just steal, vandalize, or fight. He would then harm a child in the most despicable way. In my eyes, the worst type of criminal. Please note, this next part is extremely graphic and depicts violence against a child. So if you're sensitive to these matters, viewer discretion and listener discretion is advised. He was charged with aggravated assault for abusing his live-in girlfriend's 2-year-old son on various occasions, including a horrific event while he was trying to potty train the young boy. After the arrest, he was released on bail and was instructed to stay away from his girlfriend and her son, but he ended up moving right back in with her. At the trial, court would be shocked to hear about the time when the boy's mother's friend was over and Teskey rubbed feces from the boy's diaper all over the boy's face and chest, then beat him. The friend argued with the mother, telling her to leave the valiant man. "If you don't, I will report you," she says. Yes, I know, but I love him," the boy's mother replied. The boy's brother, 7 at the time, testified in court that he recalls Teskey hitting his brother on numerous occasions and smacking him in the head, hearing slapping sounds in the bathroom while his brother would scream, and also brought up the poop in the face incident. He described Teskey as the big mean man with muscles. It was gut-wrenching to read. The transcript of this testimony was heart-wrenching. The boy's mother was also partially to blame, some would say at the time. She refused to testify at his trial, which she was eventually arrested for after ignoring multiple subpoenas. Whether it was blind love, ignorance, or outright fear, we don't know her reasoning behind it, so we will hold our judgment. I'm just not sure how a mother could put their child in this position and allow a maniac like Teskey to move back in with them after what he had done. Teskey, after being questioned about ignoring a court order and moving back into the house, said, "We like to visualize between ourselves as a Romeo and Juliet situation because we like to see each other, but we were forbidden." That's a little weird. The 2 boys were also sent to live with their father in BC after an investigation was complete, so we're glad they're safe. In 1994, the Court of Queen Bench found Teskey guilty of having caused bruises around the toddler's eyes, forehead, back, as well as injuries to the child's penis. He almost tore off the penis of the poor child. The Edmonton Journal would report it as having been pulled so hard that it tore at the base. The Crown seeked to have Teskey declared a dangerous offender, but the request was denied. Teskey would receive a 6-month sentence only for the assault, even though he was considered a psychopath. After serving that 6-month bid, he was again right back to his life of crime. This would bring us to that fateful day on November 21st, 2000, when Leo Teskey savagely beat Dougal Miller into a vegetative state. Dougal Miller was the caretaker of the building and was woken around 7 a.m. that morning by a tenant complaining about a man sleeping in the foyer of the building. Dougal, who also lived in the building, in only his robe, went down to investigate. As he was walking through his Norwood apartment building at 9524 114th Avenue that he and his wife Leslie owned, he came across the then 30-year-old Teskey passed out drunk in the hallway. Dougal tried to wake up Teskey numerous times until he gained consciousness. Trying to get him out the door, Dougal tried to reason with him, but he was a ticking time bomb. And Teskey then snapped, and in a violent rage, he crushed Miller's entire skull, broke his nose, jaw, and orbit bones, fractured his ribs, and left one of his ears completely detached from his body. He wasn't found until 9:30 a.m. that morning by his friend Robert, a mail carrier who was making his usual rounds on the morning of November 21st, 2000. He came upon the horrendous scene in the foyer of the apartment complex that will forever haunt him: the naked and beaten body of Dougal Miller in a pool of blood. Blood in multiple locations on the floor and splattered all over the walls. The face of Miller was so badly swollen, Robert didn't even immediately recognize him as his friend. Robert yelled at the man to see if he was alive, and he got muted responses. There was a gurgling sound, Robert testified. Weeks after the attack, a public plea by Miller's wife, Leslie, prompted phone calls from a tipster that would lead investigators to Teskey. The Edmonton Journal wrote, after the heinous attack, Teskey would tell doctors he felt awful about the beating. In my opinion, I think that was a big farce. There's just no way. As he was compelled to take Miller's keys after the beating, going into the victim's apartment, stealing a TV and other items before driving away in Miller's car. Later, he took the stolen goods to a pawn shop and pawned them. Witnesses would help identify Teskey as the sleeping man in the hallway. Jason, a building tenant, testified. He was heading out to start his car around 6 a.m. on November 21st when he came across a scruffy-looking man sleeping on the building's second-floor landing. Jason looked at the man again as he returned to say goodbye to his pregnant wife and to warn her about the man's presence. Then again, he saw the man when he left for work. Shortly thereafter, Jason's pregnant wife, Melanie, heard Dougal talking to someone outside the door. The conversation sounded calm. She then heard what sounded like tires bumping down the stairs. A few weeks later, Jason identified Teskey from police mugshots. The guy I saw in the hallway is the same guy in the picture, Jason testified. However, a police officer who specializes in photo lineups raised questions about how the lineup was done. I guess they messed it up a little bit. 3 of the same mugshots were inadvertently included in both groups of photos, raising some questions. Police, however, did find 2 fingerprints on a puzzle box in the hallway that was from Dougal's suite, one of them matching the right ring finger of Teskey. In a 45-page assessment, a forensic psychologist and a forensic psychiatrist said he scored 100% in tests that determined his propensity to reoffend. Experts concluded at his dangerous offenders hearing that Teskey is a lost cause without a conscience, and for the protection of society should spend the rest of his natural life in jail without mercy. It was further concluded that there are no rehabilitative programs in prison to treat such a demented mind. Teskey shows no remorse because he believes he has done nothing wrong. Teskey has been diagnosed numerous times with an antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic and borderline tendencies, and meets the criteria of a psychopath. A report found that he had a history of feigning mental illness for secondary gains, and he exhibited poor impulse control, callousness, and a lack of remorse. Teskey was tried for the assault twice. Though he was convicted in 2002, he managed to win an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, and a second trial was ordered. The second trial ended up being necessary in order to uphold the due process we all believe in. I won't get into the details as to why, because I wanted to keep this episode a little bit shorter. In the first trial, Dougal himself was wheeled into the courtroom in his special mobile hospital bed to face his attacker. He couldn't see his attacker or focus on the heinous criminal's face, but he knew he was there. His wife, Leslie Miller, said for the first time since the savage attack on November 21st, 2000, Teskey was forced to see what he did to her husband. His presence was a powerful picture. In 2008, Teskey was transferred to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation and was caught having sex with a fellow patient who was described as, quote, intellectually impaired. Allegations Teskey would later deny. On May 16th of that same year, Leslie Miller meets with the Alberta Premier Ed Stelmach as a part of her continuing petition of the government to improve access to funds for victims of crime. She became a loud voice for victims of crime. Teskey was reconvicted on February 8, 2008, and then once again on July 23, 2010, he was found to be a dangerous offender. Shortly after his conviction, guards then found drugs inside 2 plastic Kinder Egg containers in Teskey's cell bed. At the Edmonton Remand Center, they found MS Contin and a large amount of cocaine and methamphetamines. Teskey was convicted of possession for the purpose of trafficking. He was convicted in March 2012 and had 5 years added to his indefinite sentence. During a second attempt at appeal that was ultimately unsuccessful, Teskey wrote a letter to the court describing his sentence for the assault was overkill, and the fact that Dougal lived. Even though Miller did survive, he was never again able to feed himself or speak and had to be changed like a baby, his wife said. He learned to communicate through blinking. During all 3 of his dangerous offender hearings, psychiatrists testified that Teskey was a highly intelligent psychopath. The hearings also revealed Teskey's troubled beginnings. Court heard Teskey and his siblings were exposed to sexual and violent abuse. Drugs, alcohol, and the Edmonton city street life at a young age would leave them scarred. Teskey's early noted act of aggression was trying to kill his father by striking him with a claw hammer at the age of 3. A psychiatrist reported, Teskey himself claimed to have a sexual experience by age 4. He began skipping school in grade 1, and he started using drugs at the age of 8. As a child, Teskey would scream for up to hours if he didn't get his way. Just before his 12th birthday, Teskey was playing and lit a fire that burned down his house and killed his uncle, who was staying with them. At 15, Teskey encountered a notorious pedophile who fed the teen drugs and alcohol to have sex with him. Teskey had sex with him 15 to 20 times under the premise that the encounters were rehearsals for a starring role in a pornographic film. Eventually, Teskey was charged for assaulting the man, who himself would later be convicted of gross indecency. Though his past does not excuse his actions, it helps you understand just a little bit of where he came from and the direction he was led in. In June 2013, a scrapbook was allegedly discovered in Teskey's cell that contained a collage of pictures of young, naked women and boys. No charges were laid. In September 10th, 2014, Teskey's appeal of his dangerous offenders designation is dismissed in a unanimous decision by the Alberta Court of Appeal. This would pretty much seal his deal. Sadly, on September 24th, 2016, Dougal Miller died after 16 years in 24/7 continuing care. Something that really caught my eye when doing this research was Dougal couldn't speak for himself, so on his wall near his bed at the Capital Care Norwood Continuing Care Facility hung a note. It revealed a little bit about who he was, so his nurses would know. The sign said, "What is special about me? I love classical music. Play my CDs daily for me, please. My wife's name is Leslie. I have a dachshund named Charlie. I love golf. I also made wine. I am a civil, electrical, and mechanical engineer, and I have worked all over the world, including Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. I understand what is being said to me. I just cannot speak back. Yet." Leslie Miller, sadly, would then also die on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2019, unexpectedly at the age of 73, only 2.5 years after her husband, Dougal Miller. She was an amazing person who cared for her husband for all those years and relentlessly fought for justice. I really hope they've been reunited. The Edmonton police said they would not rule out any future murder charges against the individual responsible if Dougal died. But to date, no murder charges have been laid, and there is no updates in the case. Teskey was classified as a medium security inmate, believe it or not, from March 2019 to October 2020, but a classification back to maximum security was being considered because of many factors. During the past few years, illegal contraband, including homebrewed alcohol, tattoo gear, and stabbing weapons, have been discovered in his cell. He has also been involved in numerous fights, including an attack in November 2020, where he allegedly stabbed another inmate in the arm through a food slot. Teskey in 2020 planned to change his name and filed a court order to prevent the media from publishing his new identity. He told a court of Queen's Bench Justice that he hoped to get on with his life anonymously should he be released on parole. He lost his legal bid to keep a new identity secret. Service Alberta Minister Nate Glubish plans to amend the legislation to bar dangerous offenders from legally changing their name. This is still currently underway to stop dangerous offenders from changing their names, as currently only sexual offenders are barred. Most recently, Leo Teskey's application for day parole and full parole were denied in January 2021 by the Parole Board of Canada. There's no supervision strategies available to ensure you do not reoffend violently, the parole board said. Based on his violent criminal history and problematic behavior, Teskey presented too high of a risk to society to be given his freedom. The board determined, during his time behind bars, Teskey has been involved in numerous assaults and linked to various crimes. Your criminal history is very serious and violent, and many people have been victimized by our actions, the board wrote to Teskey in its 3,600-word decision. Teskey, now 51 or 52, has been incarcerated since the year 2000. His designation as a dangerous offender could mean life behind bars, but that parole must be considered every 2 years. With over 170 crimes and 37 convictions, he will most likely live out the remainder of his miserable life in a cold prison cell. Thank you so much for listening to episode 7, Dangerous Offender. Talk to you soon.